Imagine a small town where the rain falls heavy on cracked sidewalks and a mother fights silently against illness, hiding her pain so she won't lose the only thing she treasures, her little girl. One winter night, everything nearly shatters, until an unlikely circle of strangers steps forward, led by a retired nurse, a loyal German shepherd, and a community that refuses to let love be broken apart. Their journey will test the limits of compassion, courage, and what it truly means to be family. Where are you watching this story from today? Leave a comment and let us know, and may your day be filled with light and kindness. The town of Maple Hollow, Ohio, stirred slowly awake beneath a pale autumn sky. It was early morning when mist still clung to the edges of rooftops and the fields beyond town were brushed with frost. Maple Hollow was not a large place. It was the sort of town where the church bells still marked the passing of hours, where streets were lined with clapboard houses whose paint was often chipped by years of winters, where life moved with a steady rhythm but always carried an undercurrent of hardship. On this particular morning, the sky was painted with the faintest blush of rose and amber, but the crispness in the air promised another cold day. At the corner of Main Street, inside the brick municipal building that held the fire department on one side and the dispatch center on the other, Helen Carter wrapped her fingers around a steaming paper cup of coffee, her breath visible in the chilled room as she settled into her shift. Helen was 55, a woman whose life had been defined by voices through a headset rather than conversations across a dinner table. She had short-cropped silver hair tucked neatly behind her ears, sharp blue eyes magnified by rectangular glasses, and a frame that had grown sturdy over years of sitting long hours, yet carrying the weight of emergencies that left her restless at night. Her skin carried the lines of fatigue etched by decades of midnight shifts and crises, but her posture was proud, upright, as if bracing always for the next storm. She had spent more than 30 years working as a dispatcher, and though she carried herself with a calm demeanor, those who knew her well also knew she lived with a quiet grief. Her son, Michael, had died in a car accident at 16, and since then, Helen had poured her life into the work of saving strangers, perhaps as penance for the one she could not save. She was known for her steadiness, firm, kind, and unshakably professional. Yet beneath that exterior was a woman who never stopped hoping that if she stayed vigilant, maybe fewer children would be left voiceless in the dark. At 6:14 a.m., the light on her console flashed red. She pressed the button and lifted her head, her voice steady, calm, the same tone she had used thousands of times before. 911, what's your emergency? At first there was silence. Then Helen heard the faint sound of breathing, uneven, shallow, like the tiny gasp of someone who didn't want to be heard. She leaned forward in her chair, pushing the headset closer. Hello? This is 911. Do you need help? For a moment, nothing. And then a voice, fragile as if made of glass. There's ants in my bed, and nobody's home. Helen's pulse quickened. It was the voice of a child. She softened her tone, careful not to frighten. Sweetheart, my name's Helen. Can you tell me yours? In the background, she could hear the low hum of a television playing cartoons, the rattle of old window panes shaken by the wind. Lily, the child whispered. Lily Parker. The name landed with weight. Helen scribbled it on her notepad. Lily, that's a beautiful name. How old are you, honey? The answer was barely audible. 6. The girl whimpered after the word, as though speaking it cost her strength. My legs hurt real bad. I can't close them. Helen's training kicked in, her fingers flying across the keyboard to signal for a trace on the call while her voice remained steady. I'm so sorry your legs hurt, Lily. Can you tell me where your mommy or daddy is right now? A rustling came through the line, and then Lily answered, Mommy had to go. She said, Don't open the door for nobody. The words were heavy, rehearsed, as though this was not the first time the instruction had been given. Helen swallowed hard, willing her own heart not to break. Lily, you're being so brave, she said gently. I'm sending some nice people to help you. They wear uniforms, and it's safe to let them in. Can you tell me what your house looks like? Is it big or little? There was a pause, then Lily's voice again. It's little. It's yellow, but the paint's coming off. There's a broken flower pot by the steps. Helen repeated this to the units already dispatched. As she did, she noticed something new in the background, a bark, low but distinct, from what sounded like a large dog. The sound was protective, not threatening, as though the animal was standing guard near the girl. Helen tilted her head closer to the microphone. "Lily, is there someone else there with you? A dog, maybe?" A softer tone filled the line, the girl's voice catching with effort. "Ranger, he's my friend. He keeps me safe." Helen wrote the word quickly. Ranger, German Shepherd. Outside of Maple Hollow, German Shepherds were common among farmers and law enforcement, but Helen pictured this one not as a working dog, but as the companion of a child. She imagined a broad black and silver coat, intelligent amber eyes, and an animal that carried loyalty like armor. In truth, Ranger was 7 years old, large and muscular, with a thick double coat that had grayed slightly around the muzzle. He had belonged to Lily's late father, once trained for search and rescue. But since the man's passing 2 years earlier, Ranger had shifted roles, from partner to guardian of a little girl too small for the burdens placed upon her. His left ear was slightly notched from an old wound, and though his age was beginning to show in the stiffness of his gait, his presence in the Parker home was one of constant vigilance. To Lily, Ranger was not just a pet. He was her shield, her secret keeper, and in many ways, the only steady protector she knew. Helen tapped her console, watching the digital map blink as the address lock came through. "All right, Lily, I've found your house. My friends are almost there. Can you hear the sirens?" A silence, then a whisper. "Yes." "Will they make the hurting stop?" Helen's throat tightened. "They're very good at helping kids feel better. They'll take care of you." As the seconds ticked by, Helen kept Lily talking, asking about her favorite cartoons, her stuffed animals. "I have a bunny," Lily said. "His name is Hoppy. He's missing an ear." Helen smiled despite herself. "That's a perfect name for a bunny." Through the line, she heard sirens growing louder, the rising crescendo of help closing in. "There's someone knocking," Lily whispered. Helen heard muffled voices, then the static crackle of first responders' radios. A man's voice came through, firm but gentle. "We've got her. Dispatch." The call ended, but Helen remained motionless, staring at her screen. In 30 years, she had heard every kind of emergency, but some calls hollowed her out more than others. The morning sun was higher now, spilling pale gold through the old window frames of the dispatch room. Helen set her coffee aside, cold and untouched, and whispered a prayer into the stillness, for Lily, for whatever circumstances had left a 6-year-old alone and in pain, and for the German Shepherd she had not seen but already knew was more than just a dog. Then she drew in a steadying breath, reset her console, and prepared herself for the next call. The day in Maple Hollow had only just begun. The wail of sirens faded as the first responders slowed their vehicles on Maple Hollow's east side, where the streets grew narrower and the houses leaned closer together. The neighborhood bore the marks of time and struggle, siding faded by sun and weather, porches sagging under years of use, yards cluttered with toys left behind by children who had grown up too fast. Morning frost still glazed the roofs, catching the pale light, but it did little to soften the sense of weariness that hung in the air. The lead ambulance braked at the curb beside a small yellow house whose paint peeled in long strips. Its front steps sagged under the weight of neglect, and a broken flower pot lay overturned on the porch, just as the dispatcher had described. The engine idled while 2 paramedics climbed out, followed by a patrol car pulling in behind them. Daniel Ruiz, the senior paramedic, shouldered his medical bag as his boots crunched over gravel. He was 38, of medium build with a trim black beard, his hair cropped close and already showing silver at the temples. His deep-set brown eyes carried the steady focus of someone who had seen too much but refused to let weariness dull his compassion. Born to immigrant parents who worked 2 jobs apiece, Daniel had grown up in hardship but turned that background into a drive to help others, especially children. He had a reputation among colleagues for being both no-nonsense and unexpectedly gentle when the situation demanded it. Beside him moved Emily Shaw, 10 years younger, fresh in her paramedic career, yet already tempered by the realities of Maple Hollow's emergencies. She was tall and lean, with pale skin and a scatter of freckles across her cheeks. her auburn hair pulled into a neat ponytail. Her green eyes often betrayed her emotions before her voice did. She was passionate, occasionally impulsive, but with a heart that ached for people in pain. Unlike Daniel, who concealed his empathy under a mask of professionalism, Emily wore hers openly. She had once lost a younger brother to illness, a loss that had shaped her into someone determined never to let another family feel abandoned. From the patrol car stepped Officer Mark Reynolds, a man in his early 40s whose sturdy frame filled out the dark blue uniform of the Maple Hollow Police Department. He had storm gray eyes and short dark brown hair cropped neat beneath his cap. A faint shadow of stubble lined his jaw, a habit born less of laziness than of long shifts that blurred one day into the next. Mark carried himself with calm authority, yet there was a weariness about him, a guardedness that came from years of seeing too many homes like this one, too many children caught between poverty and circumstance. Still, he was respected for his fairness. Though blunt at times, he had a steady sense of justice and a quiet way of offering reassurance. Daniel climbed the porch steps first, knocking firmly on the door. "Emergency. Services!" His voice was loud but steady. The house gave no reply, but the sound of cartoons hummed faintly within, as well as a bark, low, guttural, protective. He knocked again, louder. "Lily, my name is Daniel. The nice lady from 911 sent us to help you." There was a pause, then a strained little voice filtered through the wood. "I can't open the door." Daniel crouched near the doorknob, his tone gentle. "Is it locked, sweetheart? Can you tell us where the key is?" A silence, then the faintest reply. "Under the turtle." Mark's gaze swept the porch until he spotted a small stone garden turtle near the steps, half buried in dirt. He crouched, pried it up, and there lay a tarnished key. With a click, the lock turned, and Daniel pushed the door open. The smell struck first, not rot, not filth, but a musty blend of stale air, unwashed laundry, and the sour tang of fever. The living room was cluttered, but not chaotic. Toys spilled across the floor, dishes sat stacked in the sink, unopened mail piled on a low table. It was the home of someone struggling, not someone indifferent. On the fridge, children's drawings were carefully taped in rows, faded with age but lovingly displayed. From deeper inside came a sound, small, uneven breathing, and another, the solid thump of paws. Ranger appeared first. The German shepherd barreled into view from the hallway, hackles raised, his amber eyes fixed on the intruders. His black and silver coat bristled like armor, and his teeth flashed as he let out a warning growl. Emily instinctively stepped back, her hand half lifting in defense, but Daniel raised a calming hand. "Easy, boy," he said softly, holding still. Ranger's muscles tensed, his stance protective, his eyes flicking between the strangers and the room behind him. Then a weak voice spoke from the hallway. "It's okay. He's my friend." The growl softened. Ranger turned his head, ears pricking toward the voice, then looked back at the newcomers with a gaze that still held suspicion but no longer threat. Slowly, he stepped aside, as if granting them passage on his terms. They followed the voice down the narrow hall to a small bedroom. There, on a rumpled bed, lay Lily Parker. Her blonde hair was tangled against damp cheeks, her face flushed red from fever. She clutched a stuffed rabbit missing one ear tightly to her chest. Her body looked far too small beneath the worn quilt, her eyes wide with both fear and relief as strangers entered her world. Daniel knelt beside the bed, setting his bag down carefully. "Hey there, Lily. I'm Daniel, this is Emily, and that's Officer Reynolds. We're here to help you feel better." He smiled gently, though his chest tightened at the sight of her frailty. Emily's eyes immediately scanned the child's condition, already noting the pallor beneath the fever flush, the stiffness in her legs, the way her small body trembled. Mark stood in the doorway, one hand resting lightly on his belt, eyes flicking from Lily to the dog that had taken position at her bedside like a sentinel. Ranger's ears were forward, his body pressed close enough that Lily's small hand rested on his fur, as though he were the anchor keeping her tethered to safety. Daniel pulled a thermometer from his kit. "We're just going to check your temperature, sweetheart." "Nothing scary." Lily nodded faintly, squeezing her rabbit tighter. Emily's voice softened. "What's your bunny's name?" "Hoppy," Lily whispered. Emily smiled. That's a perfect name. As Daniel worked, Emily glanced around the room. It was modest, but there were details that spoke of care. Storybooks stacked neatly, a calendar on the wall with school events marked in bright pen, drawings tacked above the bed. This was not abandonment. It was struggle painted in quieter strokes. Mark's radio crackled softly with updates from dispatch, but he turned the volume down, unwilling to disrupt the fragile calm. He had seen children in true neglect, children locked in filth and hunger, but this felt different. He watched the dog's steady gaze, the child's faint smile when her hand buried in the thick fur. Something told him this story was not what it first seemed. Daniel's voice cut through his thoughts. She's running a high fever? We'll need to transport her immediately. Emily nodded, already preparing the stretcher. Lily whimpered, her grip on Ranger tightening. Can he come? She whispered. Please don't leave him. Daniel hesitated only a moment. If he'll let us, sweetheart, he can ride along. Ranger seemed to understand. He lowered his head, pressing his muzzle against Lily's arm, then looked at Daniel with a steady, unblinking gaze, as if weighing his worth. Daniel met the gaze and nodded. All right, big guy, you're coming too. The stretcher was brought in, and carefully, gently, they lifted Lily from her bed. Ranger paced beside them, every muscle taut, his amber eyes never leaving her. As they passed through the living room, Emily noticed again the drawings on the fridge, the careful notes on the calendar, details that spoke of love, not neglect. And yet the reality remained. A 6-year-old had been left alone, gravely ill. Outside, the morning air bit sharper, the frost beginning to melt under a pale sun. Lily's breathing was shallow, her tiny voice weak as she whispered, "Will they make the hurting stop?" Daniel's smile was tender, though his eyes betrayed his worry. "Yes, Lily. They'll help you." The ambulance doors closed, Ranger leaping in beside her with the grace of a guardian who would not abandon his post. Officer Reynolds watched them go, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. He had no answers yet, only questions that weighed heavy in his chest. Where was the mother? What battles had this family been fighting? And why did a German Shepherd seem to carry more truth in his eyes than any report ever could? The ambulance barreled down Maple Hollow's main road, its sirens echoing against storefronts that were only just beginning to stir. Morning commuters pulled to the side, eyes widening at the sight of a stretchered child and a German Shepherd hunched protectively beside her. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic wipes and metal, of fear mixed with determination. Daniel kept one hand steady on Lily's vitals, his face tight with concentration, while Emily checked her oxygen, murmuring reassurances though the girl's eyes flickered weakly. Ranger sat rigidly near her legs, his bulk pressed against the stretcher, as if his weight alone could anchor her to life. His ears twitched at every bump of the road, his gaze snapping between Lily and the paramedics, a soldier refusing to stand down. By the time they reached Maple Hollow General Hospital, the emergency bay lights blazed against the pale sky, fluorescent strips glinting off polished glass. Orderlies pushed the doors open as Daniel and Emily wheeled Lily inside, Ranger trotting in lockstep. A nurse at the intake desk began to protest the dog's presence, but one glance at the child's small hand buried in Ranger's fur silenced her words. Inside the trauma bay, a new figure took charge, Dr. Anika Patel, the attending physician on call. She was in her late 30s, tall with a graceful bearing, her dark hair swept back into a neat bun. Her almond-shaped brown eyes were sharp yet calm, the kind that seemed to see everything at once without flinching. Raised in a family of physicians in Chicago, she had grown into a woman of precision, her calmness forged during years of chaotic urban ER shifts. To colleagues, she was known as unyielding in crisis, but quietly compassionate afterward, the type who bought coffee for interns after scolding them for mistakes. Her voice cut clean through the noise. 6-year-old female, febrile, limited mobility and legs. Let's get vitals, CBC, blood cultures, and IV access. At her side moved Nurse Margaret Doyle, who adjusted the blankets around Lily with hands that carried decades of experience. 65 years old, her face was lined but kind, her gray hair pinned simply, her eyes a gentle blue that still managed to spark with authority. Margaret had spent 40 years in pediatric wards and ERs, and though she was only 2 weeks from retirement, she worked with a precision and patience that came from muscle memory and a deep well of care. Her voice was warm as she introduced herself to Lily. "Hello, sweetheart. My name is Margaret. We're going to help you feel better." She tucked the blanket securely, the kind of small gesture that meant as much as any medication. Officer Mark Reynolds arrived minutes later, pushing through the sliding doors in his navy jacket, the morning chill still clinging to him. His storm gray eyes swept the ER quickly, locking on Lily, on the dog at her side, and on the medical team moving with efficient urgency. He stood quietly in the corner, his presence steady but watchful, taking in every detail. He knew his job was not only law enforcement now, but also documenting the circumstances for child services. And yet, looking at the girl's fragile form and the dog pressed faithfully to her side, he felt less like an enforcer and more like a witness to something he did not yet understand. Ranger had not moved, though his muscles coiled each time a new nurse stepped close. His thick black and silver coat bristled whenever a stranger leaned too near. But Lily's small voice soothed him. "It's okay, Ranger. They're helping." At that, he would lower his head back to the stretcher, amber eyes unblinking. While Dr. Patel ordered labs, Margaret noticed something unsettling. When a nurse prepared to draw blood, Lily did not flinch. She extended her small arm with practiced patience, turning her face away but holding still. "You're very brave with needles," Margaret said softly, taking Lily's other hand. "Mommy says I'm her brave girl," Lily whispered, her voice faint but matter of fact. Margaret's eyes flickered with concern. This was not the reaction of a child new to hospitals. Emily, watching nearby, frowned as she helped prepare supplies. "It's like she's done this before," she murmured to Daniel. He nodded grimly. "Too familiar. Something's not right." Mark shifted his weight, his gaze moving to Ranger again. The dog hadn't left Lily's side, his ears swiveling at every sound, his breathing steady but alert. Mark had seen K9 dogs on duty before, but this was different. Ranger's loyalty seemed woven not from training alone, but from something deeper, as if his very identity had been remade around protecting this one child. Meanwhile, Margaret brought crayons and a scrap of paper to distract Lily while tests were processed. "Would you like to draw while we wait?" she asked kindly. Lily nodded, clutching Hoppy with one hand while scrawling on the page with the other. As colors spread across the paper, Margaret leaned closer. "What are you making?" "This is Hoppy," Lily explained, pointing to a brown blob with one long ear. "And this is Mommy." She drew a tall figure with long hair beside a syringe detailed with surprising accuracy. Margaret's pulse quickened. "What's this?" "That's for Mommy's medicine," Lily replied innocently. "Sometimes her hands shake too much, so I help her count." Margaret's eyes met Dr. Patel's across the room. A silent understanding passed between them. This child had seen far more than most. While the doctors worked, the hospital administration notified Child Protective Services. And soon, Sophia Lane arrived. She was in her mid-30s, with chestnut hair cut in a sharp bob, her business suit immaculate even this early in the morning. Her gray eyes carried a mixture of determination and skepticism, the kind of gaze that scanned for truth and lies in equal measure. She had worked a decade in CPS, developing a reputation as firm, pragmatic, and unwilling to be swayed by sentiment. Yet beneath her professional veneer lay scars from her own childhood in foster care, a fact she rarely shared, but which influenced the caution in every decision she made. Sophia's arrival shifted the room's atmosphere. She approached the bed, her clipboard in hand, her expression measured. "This is Lily Parker?" she asked, her voice steady but cool. Margaret bristled slightly at the clinical tone, but held her tongue. Mark stepped forward, giving a brief nod. She was found alone at home. High fever, unable to move her legs. A dog was with her, seems to be protective. His eyes lingered on Ranger, whose gaze narrowed on the newcomer with quiet suspicion. Sophia jotted notes. "Where is the mother?" Mark shook his head. "Unaccounted for. We're working on it." As the conversation continued, Margaret focused on Lily's hair, gently combing tangles from the golden strands while humming softly, a melody she remembered from her own mother long ago. She caught Lily's faint smile and held on to it, knowing that sometimes the smallest comforts could steady a child more than all the clinical precision in the world. For a moment, time seemed to hold still, the child feverish but calm, the dog ever watchful, the nurse tender, the doctor precise, the officer guarded, and the CPS worker already calculating. Each played their role, yet around the edges of it all hung questions not yet answered. Why had Lily been left alone? Why did she know so much about syringes? And what unseen battles were her mother fighting beyond the yellow house's peeling paint? When the first lab results arrived, Dr. Patel frowned slightly but gave no details aloud, only signaling for more tests. Margaret noticed the crease in her brow, the hesitation in her movements, and her heart sank. As the shift rolled forward, the child remained in her hospital bed, guarded by the unwavering presence of Ranger. The German shepherd lay sprawled across the tile floor, his muzzle resting on his paws, yet his amber eyes never once closed. He was more than a dog here. He was the unspoken truth of this family, the silent witness to its hidden struggle. The automatic doors at Maple Hollow General's ER slid open with a rush of cold air, letting in a woman whose breath came in ragged gasps. Karen Parker pushed through, her fast food uniform wrinkled from a double shift, the bright red polo shirt stained with grease, her visor still jammed in her bag as if she had run straight from work. She was 29, slender but worn down, her shoulders stooped under the weight of years that should not have aged her so quickly. Her blonde hair was pulled into a messy ponytail, strands plastered to her temples with sweat. Her skin, pale beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, carried faint shadows beneath her eyes, and her lips were dry, as if she had forgotten to drink water while rushing from one obligation to the next. Karen's movements carried a frantic urgency. She stumbled to the intake desk, her voice breaking as she pleaded, "My daughter, Lily Parker, where is she? They said she was brought here." Her eyes darted desperately until they landed on a small cluster of figures near one of the bays. Her feet carried her forward before the receptionist could even answer. Ranger's head shot up first. The German shepherd, who had lain curled at Lily's bedside like a sentinel carved from stone, suddenly rose. His ears pricked, tail stiff, muscles tense as he studied the figure approaching. For one suspended heartbeat, the dog bristled, unsure, his amber eyes narrowed. Then Lily's weak voice lifted. "Mommy." The single word broke the tension. Ranger's stance eased, and with a low whine, he padded toward Karen, pressing his large head against her trembling hands. Karen dropped to her knees, clutching the dog's thick fur with one hand, while reaching desperately for Lily with the other. "Baby, I'm here." "I came as soon as they called." Her voice cracked, the weight of panic pouring into every syllable. Lily's fevered eyes brightened at the sight of her mother, and she released Hoppy just long enough to grip her mother's wrist. From the corner, Officer Mark Reynolds straightened, his storm-gray eyes narrowing as he studied Karen. He had seen hundreds of parents walk into ERS, some indifferent, some guilty, some shrouded in excuses. This woman, however, was something different. Her exhaustion seemed carved into her bones, her desperation palpable, yet his duty pressed like a stone in his chest. A 6-year-old had been found alone, and answers were required. Sophia Lane, clipboard in hand, approached next. Her bobbed hair swung slightly as she walked, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Her tone was measured but cool. "Mrs. Parker, I'm with Child Protective Services. We'll need to discuss the circumstances that led to your daughter being left unattended." Karen flinched at the words, her arms tightening protectively around Lily's small hand. "I didn't abandon her. I had to work. There was no one else." Her voice trembled, raw and defensive, yet steady enough to reveal that she had rehearsed these words, perhaps to herself, in many sleepless nights. Nurse Margaret Doyle, standing at Lily's side, watched quietly. With her decades of experience, she had learned to see beyond the first impression. As Karen lowered herself into the chair by the bed, Margaret noticed details others might dismiss. The way Karen winced slightly as she bent her knees, how her fingers trembled when she smoothed Lily's hair, the faint rash visible along the neckline of her uniform. Her joints seemed swollen, her movements careful, as though every motion was a negotiation with pain. Margaret's nurse's instinct stirred uneasily. This woman was not simply tired, she was ill. Dr. Patel, professional and precise, stepped in then, updating Karen briskly on Lily's condition. Your daughter has a high fever and a serious infection. We've started treatment. She's stable now, but we'll need to keep her under observation. Karen nodded quickly, though her lips pressed tight as if bracing against judgment. Thank you, she whispered. Sophia's pen scratched against paper. Working late shifts? Leaving a 6-year-old alone? That's not acceptable care. Her tone was firm, but her eyes flickered briefly toward Ranger, who had returned to Lily's bedside and now rested his head across the girl's legs as though to remind everyone that she had not been wholly unprotected. Karen's cheeks flushed with shame and fear. I couldn't lose my hours. We're already behind on rent. I didn't have a choice. The words spilled out, brittle but honest. She reached again for her daughter, whose small fingers curled around her own. Lily whispered, her voice rasping. Mommy tries real hard. For a moment, silence filled the bay. Even Sophia hesitated, her clipboard lowering slightly as the child's defense of her mother hung in the air. Mark shifted, the lines of duty and empathy warring inside him. He cleared his throat. Mrs. Parker, we'll need your statement, but right now, the priority is your daughter's recovery. Karen nodded, swallowing hard, her eyes shimmering with unspoken dread. She leaned against the edge of the bed, pressing her forehead to Lily's small hand, as if anchoring herself. Ranger pressed closer, his massive body curling protectively around both mother and child. For the first time since the chaos began, Karen exhaled, her lips trembling with the fragile relief of being near her daughter. Margaret, standing watch, folded her arms. She had seen too many families fractured by assumptions, too many judgments made before the full truth emerged. Her gaze lingered on Karen's trembling hands, the pallor of her skin, and the determined way she clung to her child despite her obvious frailty. Something told her that beneath the accusations of neglect lay a story much deeper, one carved in illness and sacrifice rather than indifference. For now, though, there was nothing to do but observe. The child lay under blankets, the mother clutched her hand, the German shepherd kept guard, and the professionals, doctor, nurse, officer, and social worker, stood in the periphery, each drawing their own conclusions. In that circle of fluorescent light, one truth was undeniable. This family was fragile, but bound by something that demanded to be understood before it was torn apart. The following afternoon, the sky over Maple Hollow had dulled to a washed gray, the kind that pressed low against rooftops and threatened rain without delivering it. Nurse Margaret Doyle tugged her cardigan tighter as she parked her old sedan on the cracked asphalt outside a squat apartment complex at the town's edge. She had told herself she was off duty, that she had no obligation to follow the threads tugging at her conscience. And yet, here she was, standing before the place where Karen Parker lived with her daughter, drawn by the quiet conviction that something had been left unsaid within the walls of the hospital. The building was a tired 3-story rectangle of brick, its paint peeling around window frames, its stairwell echoing with distant footsteps, and the faint cry of a baby from somewhere above. Margaret climbed slowly, her knees stiff but her determination firm, until she reached the second floor. Apartment 2B bore a door whose paint was chipped near the handle, a faint crack in the wood sealed with duct tape. She knocked gently. It was not Karen who answered, but the German shepherd. Ranger's bark thundered from the other side before the door cracked open. The dog's head pushed through first, his black and silver coat filling the narrow space. His ears pricked high, nostrils flaring as he sniffed Margaret with suspicion. Then Karen appeared behind him, shoulders sagging, eyes ringed with exhaustion. "Mrs. Doyle?" Karen asked, her voice cautious. She was not wearing her uniform this time, but a faded sweatshirt and leggings that clung awkwardly to her swollen joints. Her blonde hair was damp, as though she had only just showered after days of neglecting herself. She stepped aside reluctantly. "Come in, I guess." Margaret entered, Ranger circling her, once before retreating to his station near the couch where Lily's toys lay scattered. His amber eyes never left Margaret, but his tail wagged faintly, as though recognizing her intent was not threat, but care. The apartment smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale food. Though sparse, it bore evidence of someone trying desperately to keep order. A basket of laundry folded but not put away, a stack of unopened bills on the counter, Lily's drawings taped neatly on the fridge. Margaret's nurse's eye scanned everything, absorbing details others might miss. Karen sank into a chair at the small kitchen table, her hands clasping a chipped mug of tea. Up close, Margaret could see the redness across her cheeks, the faint rash trailing along her neckline, the way her fingers trembled as though even holding the mug was effort. "You didn't have to come," Karen said quietly. "I know what everyone thinks. That I'm careless, that I left my little girl to fend for herself." Her voice cracked but steadied again, brittle as glass. "But I didn't have a choice." Margaret lowered herself into the opposite chair, folding her hands calmly. "I came because I've seen enough families to know when something doesn't add up. You love your daughter, that much is clear. But your body—" Her gaze lingered on the swelling in Karen's knuckles. "Your body tells me a different story." Karen stiffened, her eyes flashing defensively. "I'm fine." "No, you're not," Margaret said gently, though her voice carried the weight of authority earned through decades. "I saw the way you moved at the hospital, the way your skin flushed. I've seen lupus before." The word hung heavy in the room. Karen's shoulders sagged, her mug rattling faintly against the table. Ranger, sensing the shift, rose from his spot and pressed his head against her thigh, grounding her. Tears welled in Karen's eyes as she stroked the dog's thick fur. "I was diagnosed 3 years ago," she admitted finally, her voice breaking. "Right after my husband died in that construction accident. It was like everything collapsed at once. No insurance, no savings, just me and Lily and Ranger. I couldn't stop working, not with rent, not with bills. So I stretched my medicine, took half doses when I could. Sometimes I skipped just to make sure Lily had enough to eat. I thought if I could just hold it together a little longer." She trailed off, pressing a trembling hand against her face. Margaret's heart ached as she listened. She had heard similar confessions before, but rarely from someone so young, carrying so much alone. She reached across the table, laying her hand gently over Karen's. "You shouldn't have to choose between your health and your child." Karen let out a bitter laugh, wet with tears. "But I do." Every day the silence that followed was filled only by the sound of Ranger's steady breathing and the muffled noise of children playing somewhere outside. Margaret's gaze drifted toward the corner of the room where a drawer had been left ajar. Inside, she glimpsed pill bottles and syringes, tucked hastily but not hidden well enough. Ranger moved suddenly, padding over to the drawer and pawing at it, as though drawing Margaret's attention deliberately. His nails scratched against the wood until Karen sighed, defeated. "He always knows. When I try to hide it, he finds it. He doesn't let me forget." Margaret leaned closer, her voice softening. "That dog isn't just protecting Lily. He's protecting you too." Karen looked down at Ranger, her hand buried in his fur, her tears slipping freely now. "He was my husband's dog. After the accident, Ranger never left my side. It's like he decided it was his job to keep us alive, no matter what." Margaret nodded, her throat tight. "Then let him keep doing his job. But let us help you too. You can't carry this alone." Karen wiped her cheeks with the heel of her hand, her face flushed with both shame and relief. "CPS thinks I'm a bad mother. Maybe they're right. Maybe Lily deserves someone who doesn't leave her alone." Margaret leaned forward, her voice firm now. "You're not a bad mother. You're a sick mother, and that's different. You need treatment, not judgment." For the first time, Karen's eyes met Margaret's without flinching. In them, Margaret saw a fragile hope flickering against despair. The nurse rose slowly, her joints protesting, and crossed to the fridge where Lily's drawings hung. She touched one lightly, a picture of a stick-figure woman with a tall dog and a small child holding hands. Beneath it, in shaky crayon letters, Lily had scrawled, "Me, Mommy, and Ranger." Margaret turned back, her voice gentler now. "That's the truth, isn't it? Whatever anyone else says, that's your family, and that's worth fighting for." Karen pressed her face into Ranger's fur, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Margaret let the moment settle, her own eyes misting before reaching for her bag. She could not fix everything, not yet, but she knew now the path forward. The battle Karen fought was not neglect, but survival, and Margaret would not let her fight it alone. 2 days later, the sky above Maple Hollow was unsettled, heavy clouds dragging their shadows across rooftops and filtering the light into muted grays. Inside Memorial Hospital, the halls buzzed with their usual rhythm, the hum of fluorescent lights blending with the squeak of carts and the muffled calls of nurses moving from room to room. Margaret Doyle carried herself with a kind of deliberate steadiness, her shoes clicking softly on the linoleum as she approached room 214, where Karen Parker and her daughter Lily were allowed a supervised afternoon visit. She had already worked a long morning shift, but the pull of this family kept her from leaving. The room was small but bright, a single window overlooking the parking lot where puddles reflected the restless sky. Lily sat propped up on the bed, her blonde hair brushed and tied with a fraying pink ribbon that someone had dug out of her belongings. She was building a castle from brightly colored plastic blocks donated by a volunteer group. Her cheeks were rosier now that the antibiotics had begun to work, her eyes brighter, though still shadowed by what she had endured. Karen sat beside her, dressed not in the uniform of Friendly's Burger, but in a simple cotton dress that hung loosely on her frame. Up close, the toll of illness was stark, her face pale, lips cracked, faint tremors rippling through her hands whenever she reached for a block to help Lily. Yet there was determination in her posture, as though holding herself upright by sheer will. Ranger lay at her feet, his thick black and silver coat gleaming under the hospital lights, head resting on his paws, but eyes fixed on Karen, watchful as ever. Lily giggled, the sound small but genuine, as she stacked the last block onto her castle. "Look, Mommy! It even has a drawbridge." She tugged on a small plastic piece that swung down, clattering softly against the bed rail. Karen's lips curved into a smile, but it faltered quickly. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," she whispered. Her voice sounded thinner than usual, her breath slightly labored. She blinked several times, as if trying to steady her focus. Margaret, who had entered quietly, froze as she observed. The signs were subtle but unmistakable to a nurse's eye. Sallow skin, tremors, the weary slump of someone on the edge. Officer Mark Jackson entered then, broad-shouldered in his dark blue uniform, his expression composed but cautious. At 45, with salt and pepper hair cropped short and deep creases carved into his forehead from years of exposure to both weather and worry, he carried the authority of someone who had seen too many cases go wrong. Beside him was Sophia Martinez from Child Protective Services. Her dark brown hair pulled into a neat bun, her tan blazer crisp, her eyes sharp yet not unkind. Sophia, at 38, was known for balancing compassion with procedure, though her professional demeanor often left parents wary. Margaret greeted them softly, but her gaze never left Karen. She noticed the way the younger woman's hand slipped from the block Lily had offered her, how her shoulders swayed slightly. "Karen," Margaret said quietly, stepping forward, "are you all right?" Karen shook her head as if to brush away concern. "I'm fine," she insisted, though her words were strained. She reached to smooth Lily's hair, but her hand trembled so violently that Ranger rose abruptly, pressing his body against her leg as though to brace her. Lily looked up, her smile fading. "Mommy," Karen tried to respond, but the room tilted around her. A faint gasp escaped her lips before her knees buckled. In a slow, almost surreal motion, she crumpled sideways off the chair, collapsing toward the sterile floor. Ranger lunged forward, barking sharply, his paws scraping the tile as if he could shield her from gravity itself. "Mom!" Lily screamed, scrambling to the edge of the bed. Margaret was already moving, her instincts carrying her faster than thought. She knelt beside Karen, checking her pulse, her touch steady even as her heart raced. "She's burning up," Margaret muttered, glancing at the fevered flush blooming across Karen's face. Dr. Rachel Chen entered swiftly, summoned by the commotion. A woman in her late 30s with sleek black hair, cut blunt at her shoulders, and an expression sharpened by years of emergency medicine. She dropped to her knees with a stethoscope already in hand. "Get a stretcher in here now," she ordered briskly. Nurses rushed in, the room filling with a flurry of motion. Ranger growled low, protective instincts firing, but Margaret pressed her hand to his collar. "Easy, boy," she murmured. "They're helping her." The German shepherd quivered with tension, amber eyes wide, but he obeyed, his loyalty to Margaret momentarily outweighing his instinct to defend. Sophia Martinez stood near the doorway, her jaw tight as she observed. Her job required distance, but the raw panic in Lily's voice tugged at something beneath her professional exterior. Officer Jackson, meanwhile, gently guided Lily back onto the bed, crouching so his lined face was level with hers. "They're helping your mama, sweetheart," he said softly. "She's in good hands." Karen was lifted onto the stretcher, her body limp, the monitors beeping as Dr. Chen barked orders. Lily clutched Ranger's fur, burying her face in his neck, her small shoulders shaking with sobs. Ranger stayed steady, his presence solid, a living wall between the child and the chaos. When the room finally cleared, leaving only Margaret, Sophia, and Officer Jackson with Lily, the silence that followed was almost heavier than the noise had been. Sophia glanced at Margaret, her lips pressed into a line. "You know what this means," she said quietly. "With Karen hospitalized, CPS protocol is clear. Lily cannot remain in her custody right now." Margaret's heart sank, though she had known the words were coming. "Don't you dare separate them," she whispered fiercely, though her voice remained measured. "This child's world is her mother. And Ranger, take either away and you'll break her." Sophia's expression softened, but she shook her head. "It's not my choice, Margaret. Until we can secure a stable plan, Lily will need to be placed temporarily in foster care." Lily's sobs quieted into hiccups, her small hand still tangled in Ranger's fur. The dog stood rigid, hackles raised slightly, as though he too sensed what was being decided around him. His gaze darted between Sophia and Jackson, a silent warning that any attempt to remove the child from his side would be met with resistance. Margaret crouched down beside the bed, taking Lily's free hand gently. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "your mama is very sick right now, and the doctors need time to help her, but I promise you, I'm going to do everything I can to keep you together." Lily's hazel eyes, wide and glistening, locked onto Margaret's. "Don't let them take me," she whispered. Ranger pressed closer, his body trembling but firm, as if echoing her plea. Margaret looked up at Sophia, her voice low but filled with resolve. "If the system is blind to nuance, then it will need to be shown. I won't let this family be destroyed because protocol cannot see the truth." Sophia held her gaze, something flickering behind her professional mask. She nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly, before turning toward the door. "I'll file the report," she said. "But know this, Margaret, you'll need more than conviction to change the outcome." As Sophia left, Margaret stood, her fists curling at her sides. She felt the weight of 40 years of nursing on her shoulders, the countless families she had seen fractured by well-meaning rules. This time, she vowed silently, would be different. Ranger growled softly, as though affirming her decision. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly, a storm building on the horizon. Inside, Margaret Doyle knew she had just stepped onto a battlefield not of medicine, but of justice, and she would not back down. The rain finally came to Maple Hollow that evening, sweeping across the streets in gray sheets, leaving gutters overflowing and sidewalks glistening. Margaret Doyle sat in her modest kitchen, her tea untouched and cooling, the storm tapping against the window pane like an impatient messenger. She had barely slept since Karen's collapse. The image of Lily clutching Ranger's fur, pleading eyes wide with fear, haunted her each time she closed her own. Robert, her husband of 42 years, sat across the table, folding his newspaper with deliberate precision. He was a tall man with stooped shoulders, his hair almost entirely silver, his face weathered by both age and years of carpentry work that had left his hands scarred but capable. Robert had always been pragmatic, the anchor to Margaret's fierce convictions. Tonight, however, he studied her with quiet concern. "You've got that look again," he said softly, his voice roughened by years of sawdust and cigarettes long since abandoned. "The one you had when the Johnson boy nearly got lost to the foster system." Margaret's lips pressed tight. "This is worse. The system will tear Lily from her mother unless someone intervenes, and I can't just sit back and let it happen." Robert sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You're 2 weeks from retirement, Maggie. This fight, it could consume you." She met his gaze, her eyes fierce. "Maybe it's the fight I was meant to end my career on." The following morning, the storm had cleared, but left the town washed in pale light, the air smelling of damp earth and leaves. Margaret drove not to the hospital, but to Grace Community Church, a small brick building on the corner of Willow Street. Its white steeple stood slightly crooked, weathered by decades of wind, but the sign out front still announced Wednesday potluck, all welcome. Inside, Pastor Robert Williams was arranging hymnals in the pews. He was a man in his early 60s, with salt and pepper hair and a face softened by smile lines rather than hardened by worry. Once a nurse himself, before he felt called to ministry, he carried himself with a quiet strength, the kind that came from walking alongside others through their darkest nights. "Margaret Doyle," he said warmly, his deep voice echoing in the sanctuary. "It's been too long." She clasped his hand firmly. "Robert, I need your help." They sat in his cramped office, walls lined with mismatched bookshelves, stacked with both theology and old medical texts. Margaret explained everything. Karen's illness, her collapse, CPS preparing to place Lily into foster care, the fear etched into the child's face. Pastor Williams listened intently, fingers steepled beneath his chin, occasionally jotting notes on a yellow pad. "She's not neglectful," Margaret finished firmly. "She's sick. And she's been fighting alone because she feared exactly this, losing her daughter." "There has to be another way," Pastor Williams leaned back, thoughtful. "The law favors caution when children are involved. But you're right, sometimes the law forgets compassion. We can offer both. Our congregation has a transitional apartment above the community center. It's small, but it's safe, and we can rally volunteers to provide meals, childcare, transportation. It's not a perfect solution, but it could be enough to convince the court Lily doesn't need foster placement." Margaret felt a swell of relief. "You'd do that?" The pastor smiled faintly. "It's what we're called to do. But you'll need more than a roof and meals. You'll need medical documentation, testimonies, and someone who understands the court's language." "I'll get Dr. Chen," Margaret said quickly. "She's tough, but she sees the truth when it's in front of her." "And Sophia?" Pastor Williams asked carefully. "She has influence with CPS." Margaret hesitated, remembering Sophia's measured words, her expression not quite as cold as protocol demanded. "She's not blind. I think she wants to help, but she needs permission, from herself, maybe more than the agency." As they spoke, a light knock came at the door. It was Sarah Green, the church's longtime secretary. At 50, she was tall and willowy, with graying blonde hair pulled into a bun, and a sharp gaze softened by kindness. Years earlier, she had lost her teenage son in a car accident caused by a drunk driver, a grief that had reshaped her life. Though she rarely spoke of it, the compassion that now radiated from her seemed born of surviving that loss. "Sorry to interrupt," Sarah said, holding a small stack of flyers. "But I overheard. If this young mother needs support, you'll have it. I'll start a meal rotation and organize volunteers." Her voice was firm, her grief-honed empathy leaving no room for hesitation. Margaret reached out, clasping Sarah's hand. "Thank you." That evening, Margaret returned to the hospital, exhaustion pressing on her bones, but determination pushing her forward. In room 317, Lily was curled against Ranger on the narrow bed, her small body nestled into the dog's side, her breathing steady at last. The German shepherd's ears flicked as Margaret entered, but he did not rise, content to keep watch over the child. In the adjoining room, Karen lay pale against white sheets, IV lines snaking from her arms. Her face was fragile, but when her eyes opened to see Margaret, a flicker of recognition lit them. "They're going to take her, aren't they?" she whispered, voice hoarse. Margaret sat beside her, smoothing the blanket. "Not if I can help it. I've spoken with Pastor Williams. There's a place for you and Lily, a plan that keeps you together, but we'll need proof, medical testimony, a court that believes you deserve that chance." Karen's lips trembled. "Why are you doing this?" Margaret's gaze softened. "Because no one fought for my sister when she needed it. She lost her children to the system, and it took years to undo the damage. I won't let that happen again. Not to you. Not to Lily." For a moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the steady beep of the monitor. Then Ranger rose from Lily's bed, patted over, and laid his massive head on Karen's arm, his amber eyes steady. Karen's tears slipped silently down her cheeks as she stroked the dog's fur. Margaret leaned closer. "You're not alone anymore. We're going to fight this, together." Outside, the town was quiet, the storm's remnants dripping from rooftops, but within Margaret's heart, a fire had been lit. The battle lines were drawn, not against illness, but against a system that too often confused poverty and sickness for neglect. And Margaret Doyle, 2 weeks from retirement, was ready for war. The courthouse in Maple Hollow stood like a fortress at the edge of the town square, its columns tall and pale against the washed-out autumn sky. The air carried the brittle chill of late October, leaves tumbling across the steps where people hurried inside, their coats pulled tight against the wind. Margaret Doyle climbed those steps slowly, her breath visible, her determination steady despite the ache in her knees. She carried with her not only 40 years of nursing wisdom, but also the fragile hope of a mother and child who had no one else. Inside, the courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. The waiting area outside courtroom 3 was filled with a tense silence, broken only by the shuffle of shoes and the occasional cough. Karen Parker sat hunched in a wooden chair, a scarf wrapped loosely around her neck to hide the faint rash still lingering on her skin. She looked fragile, her blonde hair pulled into a loose braid, her thin frame swallowed by a borrowed wool coat Sarah Green had pressed into her hands that morning. Yet in her hazel eyes burned a quiet fire. Lily sat on her lap, dressed in her best, an old yellow dress smoothed carefully to hide its wear. Ranger sat faithfully at their feet, the German shepherd's black and silver coat shining under the fluorescent lights, his posture proud, his gaze protective. Pastor Robert Williams stood nearby, his clerical collar peeking from beneath a gray sweater. At 63, with a broad frame and steady presence, he exuded both compassion and authority, a bridge between the spiritual and the practical. Sarah Green accompanied him, tall and willowy, clutching a folder of community pledges she had gathered in less than 2 days. Signatures from neighbors, teachers, even customers at the diner, all testifying to Karen's devotion as a mother. Dr. Rachel Chen arrived next, her hair neatly pinned back, her dark suit pressed. She carried herself with the brisk confidence of a physician who had spent years in crowded ERs, but her sharp eyes softened when they met Margaret's. "I've reviewed Karen's records," she said quietly. "The signs of lupus are clear. The interruptions in medication weren't neglect, they were survival decisions. I'll testify to that." Finally, Sophia Martinez appeared, her tan blazer immaculate, her dark hair smoothed into a bun. At 38, she was known for her composure, but today a flicker of unease shadowed her features. She had spent sleepless nights reviewing the case file, weighing protocol against conscience. As her eyes met Margaret's, she gave the smallest of nods, signaling that she was ready to stand on the side of compassion. The heavy oak doors opened. "Case of Child Protective Services versus Karen Parker," the bailiff announced. Inside, the courtroom was paneled in dark wood, the air cool and formal. Judge Marianne Ellis presided from the bench, a woman in her early 60s with short silver hair, sharp blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and an expression that betrayed little. Known for her strict adherence to law, but also her occasional flashes of mercy, she had built her reputation on weighing the letter and spirit of justice with equal gravity. The state's attorney rose first. James Holloway, a man in his 40s with a crisp navy suit and neatly trimmed beard, projected an air of efficiency. His voice was firm, but not unkind as he laid out the state's position. "Your Honor, the child in question was found alone, severely ill, while her mother was absent. While we recognize the mother's illness, the risk posed to the child cannot be ignored. Temporary foster care is the safest path until the mother can demonstrate consistent stability." Karen lowered her head, clutching Lily tighter. Ranger shifted, a soft growl rumbling in his chest, until Lily buried her fingers in his fur to calm him. Pastor Williams rose next. His deep voice carried warmly across the chamber as he outlined the church's transitional housing program, the volunteers ready to provide meals, transportation, and support. "This is not abandonment," he concluded. "It is community. And community can fill the gaps where illness and poverty leave wounds." Dr. Chen followed, her testimony precise and clinical. She described lupus in plain terms, the unpredictability of flare-ups, the way untreated disease had compounded Karen's struggles. "Her medical history does not reflect neglect, but desperation," she said firmly. "Had she been properly supported, This crisis could have been prevented. Sophia Martinez stood then, her expression composed, but her voice carrying a weight of honesty. I entered this case with the recommendation of foster placement, as protocol requires. But after thorough review and seeing the resources available, I believe foster care would cause more harm than good. Lily's best interests are served not in separation, but in supervised unity with her mother, supported by community and medical oversight. The judge listened, her face unreadable, occasionally glancing down at the thick file in front of her. Then she gestured toward Margaret. "Mrs. Doyle, you requested to speak?" Margaret rose slowly, her hands steady despite the pounding of her heart. She wore her plain navy dress, the one she had saved for funerals, but her posture was tall, her voice steady. "Your Honor, in 40 years as a nurse, I have watched families fall apart because the system could not tell the difference between neglect and struggle. Karen Parker is not neglectful. She is sick, and she has carried that sickness in silence because she feared losing her child. Lily does not need protection from her mother. She needs protection with her mother." She paused, her eyes softening as she glanced at Lily, who clung to Ranger's neck. "If you take them apart now, the damage may never heal." The courtroom was hushed, the only sound the scratch of the judge's pen against paper. Then Judge Ellis turned to Karen. "Do you have anything to add?" Karen stood shakily, her hands still clasped around Lily's. Her voice trembled but did not break. "Everything I've done, every shift I worked, every dose I stretched, was for her. I was afraid of asking for help because I thought it meant failure. But I see now that hiding only hurt us more. I love my daughter. Please don't punish her for my mistakes." The silence stretched long. Ranger sat perfectly still, his amber eyes fixed on the judge as though he too waited for her verdict. Finally, Judge Ellis removed her glasses, folded her hands, and spoke. "This is an unusual case," she said. "Standard protocol would dictate foster placement, but law is not blind to circumstance. The testimony presented demonstrates that this mother's failings stemmed from illness and lack of support, not willful neglect. Therefore, this court grants conditional approval. Lily Parker will remain with her mother, provided they reside in the Transitional Housing Program under church supervision, with daily CPS check-ins and weekly medical evaluations. This arrangement will be reviewed in 30 days. Gasps of relief rippled through the courtroom. Karen collapsed back into her chair, tears spilling freely as Lily wrapped her arms around her. Ranger barked once, sharp and triumphant, before pressing his head against Karen's knee. Margaret's own eyes filled with tears as she exhaled the breath she had been holding. Judge Ellis's gaze softened slightly. "Ms. Parker, this is a rare opportunity. Do not waste it." Karen nodded fiercely, clutching Lily and Ranger close. As the gavel struck, Margaret felt the weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the system could bend toward compassion when enough people stood together. The apartment above Grace Community Center was small, but to Karen and Lily Parker, it felt like a sanctuary. Its walls were freshly painted cream, sunlight spilling through lace curtains that Sarah Green had found in a box of donations. A quilt, stitched by the church's sewing circle, lay neatly on Lily's narrow bed, its patchwork squares bright with reds, blues, and yellows. A shelf stood in the corner, already filled with secondhand children's books. The space carried no luxury, but it carried something far more valuable, the imprint of care. Margaret Doyle stood in the doorway as Karen and Lily crossed the threshold for the first time. Karen clutched her daughter's hand, moving slowly, her body still fragile from weeks of illness. She wore jeans and a long sweater donated by a neighbor, her blonde hair pulled back but clean, her hazel eyes wide with disbelief. Lily darted inside, her ribboned hair bouncing as she ran to the bookshelf, squealing softly at the sight of so many stories waiting for her. Ranger followed with deliberate dignity, his black and silver coat gleaming, his amber eyes alert as he sniffed every corner before lying down by the window, content to claim his new watch post. Pastor Robert Williams trailed behind with a box of groceries. "We stocked the fridge," he said in his steady baritone. "Meals for the week, and the congregation signed up for a rotation. You won't go hungry." His frame filled the narrow doorway. his salt and pepper hair damp from the drizzle outside, but his expression radiated quiet assurance. Sarah Green was next, her tall, slender form balanced under the weight of a box filled with blankets and towels. Her face, lined by grief and resilience, softened into a smile as she set the items on the counter. "This is just the start," she said briskly. "The community's rallied. You'll have more than enough." Karen's throat tightened as she took it all in. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. Margaret stepped forward, resting a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Don't thank us. Just get well. That's the best gift you can give Lily." The first days were not easy. Karen's body, still adjusting to consistent medication, fought back with fatigue and pain. Some mornings, she struggled to get out of bed, joints stiff and swollen. On those days, Margaret or Sarah would arrive with breakfast, coaxing Lily into laughter with pancakes shaped like hearts. Ranger often pressed his body against Karen's legs, steadying her as she moved, his eyes always fixed on her, as though measuring her strength. Lily thrived in the new environment. She attended school each morning, with her backpack filled with fresh supplies donated by neighbors. Her teacher, Mrs. Harper, a kind woman in her late 50s with short curly hair and a penchant for colorful scarves, noticed the change immediately. "She's more focused, more joyful," she reported during a phone call to Margaret. "She even talks about the church dog, though I suspect that's Ranger." At the community center, church members came and went. One was Tom Alvarez, a retired firefighter in his 70s, with a broad chest, a limp from an old injury, and a booming laugh that filled the hallways. He volunteered to drive Karen to her weekly medical appointments, insisting, "I've got more free time than sense these days. Might as well put it to use." Another was Emily Rhodes, a young mother of 2 who brought casseroles every Thursday. Petite and freckled, with a warm smile, Emily had grown up in poverty herself and understood the quiet shame of needing help. Karen struggled to accept these offerings at first, her pride resisting. "I don't want to be a burden," she said one evening, as Sarah folded laundry with her in the small kitchen. Sarah paused, her long fingers smoothing a shirt. "After my son died, people brought me meals for months. I didn't want them either, but I learned that accepting help isn't weakness. It's giving others the chance to love you. Let them." Her voice was calm, but behind it lay the weight of her own loss, shaping her into someone who could see the cracks others hid. Slowly, Karen began to yield. She let Tom drive her to the clinic. She let Emily cook meals. She let Margaret organize her medications into a weekly pill box. And each time she accepted, the weight she carried grew lighter. Ranger became a beloved figure at the community center. Children gathered to pet him after Sunday school, their laughter ringing as he licked their hands. Older members smiled as he trotted faithfully at Karen's side during evening walks. He seemed to understand his role had expanded, not only guardian of one family, but symbol of strength for many. One crisp November morning, Margaret walked across the church courtyard to find Karen and Lily sitting on a bench beneath the bare branches of a maple tree. Karen looked stronger, her cheeks touched with color, her posture no longer bent by constant pain. Lily giggled as she tied a red ribbon around Ranger's neck, declaring him the bravest knight. Margaret sat beside them, her heart swelling. "How are you today?" she asked. Karen smiled faintly, her hazel eyes softer than Margaret had ever seen. "Hopeful," she said simply. For the first time in years. Weeks passed, and life found a rhythm. The 30-day review approached, but instead of dread, there was confidence. Dr. Chen submitted her reports showing Karen's health improving with consistent treatment. Sophia Martinez, once hesitant, now visited regularly, her reports filled with evidence of stability and support. Pastor Williams coordinated volunteers seamlessly, while Sarah kept the meal rotation running like clockwork. The story had even reached the local newspaper again, this time under the headline, "Community Rallies to Keep Family Together." On the morning of the review, Karen stood in front of the mirror in her small apartment, smoothing the borrowed dress she wore to court. Lily held her hand, her hair brushed and ribboned, her smile bright. Ranger sat tall beside them, a silent sentinel. Margaret entered, her navy coat buttoned, her eyes shining. "Ready?" Karen met her gaze in the mirror. "Yes, because this time, I'm not walking in alone." Later that day, Judge Ellis reviewed the reports in her courtroom. her stern face betraying nothing. But when she finally looked up, her words were clear. This arrangement has succeeded beyond expectation. Full custody is reinstated, continued support will be monitored, but this court believes mother and child belong together. Karen's tears flowed freely as she hugged Lily, Ranger barking once as if sealing the decision. Margaret felt her chest ache with pride. As they left the courthouse, sunlight broke through the clouds, scattering gold across the square. Margaret walked beside them, her steps steady despite her age. She knew her retirement loomed, but in her heart, she felt renewed. Perhaps endings were simply beginnings in disguise. For Karen and Lily, with Ranger at their side, life was still uncertain, still filled with challenges. But for the first time, they faced it not alone, but surrounded by love, community, and the promise of healing. And for Margaret Doyle, it was proof that sometimes the fiercest battles are the ones worth fighting to the very end. In the end, this story reminds us that even in the darkest storms, God can work through ordinary people, loyal companions, and the strength of community to create miracles. Just as Karen and Lily found healing and hope, we too can find God's hand guiding us in our daily struggles, reminding us that no one is truly alone when faith is alive. If you believe in miracles, share this story with others, leave a comment, and subscribe so we can continue spreading hope together. May God bless you and your family with love, protection, and peace. And if you trust in His power to heal and restore, type Amen in the comments as a prayer for everyone watching today.